On November 11, 1965, Ian Smith stood before a radio microphone in Salisbury and did something no British colony had done since the 13 colonies. He declared independence without permission. The Unilateral Declaration of Independence was an act of open defiance, and the world's response was swift and self-assured. Within weeks, the United Kingdom moved to strangle the rebel colony economically, and by December 1966 the United Nations Security Council had followed with Resolution 232, the first mandatory sanctions regime in UN history. Oil, arms, and a growing list of exports, tobacco, chrome, copper, asbestos, sugar, meat, and hides, were placed under embargo. 2 years later, Resolution 253 widened the noose into something close to a total trade blockade. The math seemed simple. Rhodesia's economy depended on selling what it dug out of the ground and grew in its fields to the outside world. Cut off the buyers, and the regime would collapse within months. It didn't collapse within months. It didn't collapse within years. Rhodesia ran a trade surplus for 9 of its first 10 years under sanctions, missing only during a drought year. By the mid-1970s, a British newspaper investigation could report, without much exaggeration, that Rhodesia was still selling essentially all the asbestos and copper it had sold before UDI, roughly a third of its chrome, close to half its iron ore, and about a third of its tobacco, the last of these despite tobacco being, by a wide margin, the hardest hit commodity. The country was earning something on the order of $150 million a year through sales that, on paper, were illegal under international law. The obvious question isn't whether Rhodesia beat the sanctions. It clearly did, for the better part of 15 years. The interesting question is how a landlocked, internationally unrecognized pariah state pulled off one of the most sustained sanctions evasion campaigns of the 20th century, in plain sight, with the tacit cooperation of some of the very governments that had voted for the embargo. The mechanism was deceptively simple: paperwork. Rhodesia had no coastline of its own, but it had 2 friendly neighbors that did: Portuguese-ruled Mozambique and apartheid South Africa, neither of which had any intention of enforcing a blockade against a fellow white minority government fighting the same demographic arithmetic. Goods that left Rhodesian mines and farms crossed the border, acquired a fresh certificate of origin declaring them Zambian, Mozambican, or South African, and sailed onward as if Rhodesia had never touched them. One British asbestos company, Turner and Newell, saw the writing on the wall even before UDI was formally declared and quietly set up a South African subsidiary for exactly this purpose. Asbestos never had to detour through South African territory at all. It moved straight from Rhodesian mines to the Mozambican port of Beira, arriving with a South African certificate stapled to a shipment that had never seen Pretoria. It was smuggling that required no smugglers, no false floors, and no midnight border crossings. Just a rubber stamp and a compliant customs official on the other side of an unmarked line in the bush. Oil told a similar story, though with a more layered cast of characters. Britain relied heavily on the Royal Navy to blockade the port of Beira and prevent tankers from delivering crude oil that might reach Rhodesia via pipeline. This operation came to be known as the Beira Patrol, and that ran for nearly a decade at real cost to the British taxpayer. It barely mattered. Fuel accounted for only a modest share of Rhodesia's total energy use, and what the country did need could simply be trucked and railed and overland from South Africa and Mozambique instead of shipped through the one port the Royal Navy was watching. More damning still, internal investigations later suggested that Shell and BP's own regional subsidiaries had, with knowledge reaching back to their head offices, arranged a swap system as early as 1968. Instead of shipping oil to Rhodesia directly and risking exposure, the companies would supply an intermediary elsewhere in southern Africa, which would then quietly divert an equivalent volume north across the border. The blockade the Royal Navy was enforcing at sea was being routinely defeated on paper by the very companies whose governments had voted for the sanctions in the first place. Rhodesia didn't just react to sanctions passively from behind its borders. It built an entire shadow diplomatic apparatus to make the evasion respectable. In Melbourne, a body calling itself the Rhodesia Information Centre operated for well over a decade, ostensibly as a public relations outlet countering negative press about Smith's government, but functioning in practice as a quiet advisory service for Australian businesses that wanted to keep trading with Salisbury without technically breaking the law. Its guidance was blunt and practical: route the tobacco or the minerals through a friendly intermediary, let the paperwork do the rest, and the transaction would clear customs in London or Melbourne looking like ordinary Zambian or South African commerce. Similar unofficial trade offices operated out of other sympathetic capitals, feeding foreign businesses a steady supply of the one thing sanctions busting actually required. Not bribes or smugglers' boats, but a workable answer to the question of where, on paper, this chrome or this tobacco had legally come from. And then there was Washington, which didn't even bother with the pretense of covert diversion. It simply changed its own law. Rhodesia held something in the neighborhood of 2/3 of the world's known chrome reserves, a mineral essential to stainless steel and, more urgently in Cold War terms, to defense manufacturing. When the United States honored sanctions and stopped buying Rhodesian chrome after 1965, it had to replace the supply somewhere, and the somewhere that filled the gap was the Soviet Union, whose share of American chrome imports rose sharply within a few years. To a bloc of Southern segregationist senators led by Harry F. Byrd Jr. of Virginia, the optics were intolerable. American sanctions against a white African government were making the United States more dependent on Moscow for strategic war material. In 1971, Congress passed the Byrd Amendment, a rider buried in a military procurement bill that barred the president from banning imports of any strategic mineral from a non-communist country as long as the same mineral was still being imported from a communist one. It was sanctions relief legislated openly on the floor of the US Senate over the strenuous objections of the State Department, and for 6 years, until its repeal in 1977, American factories ran on Rhodesian chrome while the UN embargo remained formally in force. Rhodesia won the sanctions war and lost the actual war anyway, and the two outcomes were connected in ways the sanctions don't work narrative conveniently skips. The false flag trade routes, the oil swaps, the Byrd Amendment, all of it kept Rhodesia's foreign currency flowing and its shelves stocked with imported machinery parts long after economists in London and New York had predicted collapse. But sanctions busting was never free, and the bill came due in a currency other than money. Every rerouted shipment of chrome or asbestos depended on South Africa and Portugal staying friendly, which meant Rhodesia's economic survival was permanently mortgaged to the political fortunes of two other collapsing settler regimes. When the Portuguese army overthrew its own government in Lisbon's Carnation Revolution of April 1974, Mozambique's independence followed within a year, and with it, the abrupt loss of the Beira corridor and hundreds of miles of previously friendly, previously porous border. Rhodesia's most reliable smuggling route didn't get shut down by UN inspectors or Royal Navy frigates. It disappeared because the neighbor supplying the false paperwork ceased to exist. That single geopolitical shock, far more than a decade of Security Council resolutions, forced Rhodesian forces into a two-front guerrilla war against Zanla infiltrating from Mozambique and Zipra operating out of Zambia. And it is that war, not the sanctions regime as such, that actually broke the country. This is the myth worth puncturing on camera. Sanctions busting bought Rhodesia time, not victory, and the machinery that made the busting possible was never sanctions-proof. It was neighbor-proof, dependent entirely on the survival of two other white minority governments whose own days were numbered for reasons that had nothing to do with Salisbury. South Africa kept the border open and the certificates flowing right up until the Lancaster House Conference in late 1979. But even Pretoria's patience had limits once the financial and military cost of propping up a war it was not fighting began to strain its own resources. By 1979, with the Rhodesian Bush War consuming an ever larger share of a shrinking white population of conscription age, and with South Africa quietly pressuring Ian Smith's successors toward a settlement, the economic ingenuity that had defeated sanctions for a decade and a half ran out of road to travel on. Zimbabwe's independence in April 1980 didn't come because the sanctions finally worked in the way the Security Council had imagined in 1966. It came because the war, fed by the same porous, sanctions-evading borders that had kept Rhodesia solvent, eventually cost more than the regime could afford to keep paying. The real lesson of Rhodesia's 15 years of sanctions busting isn't that international embargoes are toothless. Plenty of isolated regimes since have found evasion far harder without too large, complicit, contiguous neighbors willing to launder an entire national economy through customs paperwork. It's that economic sanctions and military attrition are not the same instrument, and conflating them obscures what actually ends rebellions like this one. Rhodesia's businessmen, its diplomats abroad, and its friendly Senate allies in Washington ran one of the more audacious evasion campaigns of the Cold War, and, on the narrow question of keeping the trade balance in the black, they succeeded almost completely. But the ledger that ultimately mattered wasn't measured in chrome tonnage or tobacco auction prices. It was measured in conscription call-up papers, in a border that could no longer be trusted to stay friendly, and in a war of attrition that no amount of clever paperwork could smuggle its way out of.